Ok, vamos a empezar con la primera sesión de preguntas y comentarios. Queda abierto. ¿Quién quiere empezar? No sean tímidos. Tímides. Yo puedo empezar con algunas de las preguntas del slide, pero para eso tengo que encontrar mis anteojos. Perdón. ¿Alguno de ustedes quiere comentar algo? Kathinka, Cecilia. Pero.
First of all, as one of the organizers, I would like to thank both Martha Farah and Nikolas Rose for two very interesting and two very different presentations. I think the contrast between the two sets an excellent stage for vivid and enthusiastic discussions. But I'm not going to say much more now because I'm part of the round table later and we'll do the closing session where I can have my commentary. So I would really like to hear from the audience questions for both the previous speakers.
Okay. Hay una pregunta para el profesor Rose. Si usted tuviera que proponer alguna alternativa a los problemas que plantea con su crítica a la neurociencia, ¿cuáles serían? ¿Qué propone en vez de las intervenciones neurocientíficas? Yo creo que la contestó en parte la pregunta, pero es una pregunta que viene del streaming, creo. Sí, claro, voy de vuelta. Si usted tuviera que proponer alternativas a estos problemas de las neurociencias, ¿cuáles serían las alternativas? ¿Qué propone en vez de esas intervenciones?
Yeah, I can. So, thank you for the question. It's not so much that I would suggest an alternative, it's that I would suggest a different way of framing the question. First of all, I would myself try and reduce the emphasis on what happened in the very earliest years. That is to say, I would want to explore, and I know that Sebastián here has also raised this question, I would also want to explore the temporality of what happens in the earliest years. Now, how can one explore that temporality? Well, we have some cohort studies, not very many cohort studies, that is to say studies that follow up kids across their life course, and which take neurobiological measures across their life course so that we can see or gain more evidence as to the durability, the long-term consequences of early adversity. If you look at some of the adverse childhood experiences work, they quite often work by asking adults whether they have experienced something in childhood. Well, of course, that's not a very good way round of doing it, because what an adult remembers about what happens to them in childhood is not particularly accurate. So if one can have these longer term measures, I think it would be helpful. In the few that we have, for instance, I mentioned in my talk the work on the development of the brain in these kids in Romania that had been brought up in very horrible circumstances. And it's certainly true that when the brain scans of those kids were done, when they were found in these orphanages, you could see all sorts of abnormalities. Later on in their life, those abnormalities no longer persisted. So I think one part of what one might want to do is to place this research on the early years in the context of a developing life course. A second, which is to turn the thing completely around, is to say, what kinds of interventions might we be thinking about here? If it really is the case that adversity has neurobiological effects, the kind of adversity that tends to have the most neurobiological effects are poverty, that is to say, lack of food, lack of an adequate diet, food poverty, which means that people have a bad diet because they don't have access to good diets, toxicity in their environment, which is pollution, which is the fact that certainly in some of your favelas, they are built on land which is already highly polluted, and the kids play in chemical waste, water that is polluted with chemical waste. And I'm referring here to some of the work that my friend Sylvia Grinberg has done. In other words, to try and move the focus away from the mother-child environment, mother-child relationship, that dyad, to the conditions around the families that throw them into certain kinds of adversity. That's what I would say.
Thank you, Nick. So you are saying that, perdón, tú estás diciendo, you are saying that hay un lugar para incluir la idea de que algún marcador neural pueda ser útil en un contexto de análisis.
Is there a space to analyze? Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Ustedes la escucharon,
Yes,
se la hago en
I can
inglés. So there is. ¿Hay alguna en tu propuesta?
They asked me in
Okay.
English because the translator's different.
I wonder if you think that there is a place for any kind of neural marker in a context of distal interventions in the terms that you described them.
All right, how should I put this? So let me start with the work that I'm trying to develop in our research center, which certainly argues that conditions of social adversity, toxicity, poor diet, overcrowding, housing insecurity, and all those other things do have neurobiological effects, and we can begin to trace the pathways of those neurobiological effects. They have those effects across the life course, not just in the earliest years. So I would want to try, maybe I'm not answering your question, I would want to try and move, or at least extend my concern away from those first 1,000 days, and even before those first 1,000 days, to the life of the woman before she conceives, away from the dyad of the mother and the child in the first 1,000 days, towards these more general social conditions, and to understand how those shape and constrain the lives that people living in poverty experience. It's a question really of how you frame the research. I would want to be very, very wary about using what seemed to me to be very unhelpful generalized indicators like SES as a way of framing that research. I would want to be very careful about using tests like the IQ test as a way of measuring the consequences. And I would want to be very alert to the fact that there are huge individual differences between the ways in which people respond to these different adverse circumstances. Because I think one needs to move away from the forms of argument that invite a criticism of determinism. So it's a question of trying to frame your arguments at the level of the population and changes in population, changes at the level of the population rather than the determinism of the mother-child relationship. I think that is what people like Sandra Galea and Catherine Sampson that I mentioned at the end, that's the move that they are trying to push. And if we know what has worked in physical health, and my example is always smoking, but you could take the example of diet and obesity, it's interventions at the population level that have made the major effects, not interventions at the individual level.
Okay. I have a question for Martha.
Just commenting that briefly, basically to express my agreement with that. There is an aspect also which I would like to connect to, which you mentioned, Sebastián, in your introduction, and that is that there is a socio-political, economic context in which this science is being developed and applied. There are many countries in which the society has committed a kind of paupericidio, where they reduce large portions of the population to a life in poverty. Argentina is one example. In only 4 years, about 30% of the population has been reduced to poverty. This is not an unintended side effect of a perverse governance. It's an intended redistribution of wealth where this type of statistics of poverty is being accepted. It's even applauded by those who support this kind of politics. Now you can imagine the kind of suggestions that differences in the so-called SES would lead to differences in IQ, how the kind of people who applaud this kind of politics would react to that. They would love it. Because a part of the policies of reducing large portions of a population to poverty includes dehumanizing them. We've seen that in Europe in many countries. This is not a typically South American phenomenon, unfortunately. It's a global phenomenon. In order to withdraw food, nutrition, education, healthcare from large portions of the population, you need to introduce a graded system of human value. Some people are less valuable than others. And this is where this type of research can become potentially so dangerous, because it can help dehumanize these poorer portions of the population. So I think what you're saying, Nick, is of extreme importance, both scientifically, because what you're saying is basically good scientific practice and realistic scientific practice, but it is also of a political relevance, which is of utmost importance in many countries today.
Do you want to comment, Nick?
Yes, I just want to maybe point to the work of one of my colleagues in my department, Mauricio Avendano, who's worked on some very big studies, one called Life Path and one called Mind Map. They're big global studies. And what these big global studies do, and this relates to what Kathinka just said, is that they try and look at the long-term consequences of early changes in public policy. So, for instance, they try and look at the long-term consequences on mental health, these are, long-term consequences on mental health, of changes like introducing family allowances, which enable mothers to spend more time with their kids, of introducing welfare benefits that are not conditional, generous welfare benefits, rather than welfare benefits that are conditional on people going into poorly paid work, of introducing even things that seem trivial, like the fact that elderly people can use a free bus pass in order to travel. They try and trace the long-term implications of some of these policy changes on mental health. And they find real and very significant long-term consequences on mental health of these changes at the level of policy. So here one can begin to see in these quantitative studies, using cohorts of maybe 5, 10, 15,000 people and comparing different societies, how changes in these forms of social policy can actually have very significant implications for mental health in later life. So in my own work on psychiatry, drawing on some of this work about the impact of inflammation, of stress, of microbiomes and so on, I've argued that psychiatrists should become public health practitioners. They should go out and work on public health issues, on issues like good diet, on issues like adequate funding, on issues like good housing, on all those, quotes, distal issues, because they're going to have, at the population level, more impact on people's mental health than any number of individual mental health services, any number of psychiatrists treating individuals. If you really want to turn these things around, you've got to work at the level of the population.
Thank you. Una pregunta para Marta Farah. ¿Me confirman si Marta Farah está?
Marta Farah, are you connected? Can you hear me? English, can you hear me? I'm going to make my question in English. Ask my question in English. Why do you still use the IQ indicators and SES? And is there any alternative to overcome the obstacles or the limitations of those indicators?
To answer that. And first, let me say that everything that has been said on this stage in this discussion, I agree with. The one thing I don't agree with is taking the next step to say, so do not study proximal and internal processes. I think poverty is a serious problem. That's an understatement. And we need what in the Navy they say, all hands on deck, right? There is value in working on this problem at many levels. So I am not saying, neuroscience as an alternative to changing and improving structural features of the environment. I'm saying let's do both. I think there is additional value to neuroscience. But to the specific question, okay, I may have been misunderstood as using IQ in my research or citing neuroscience research that uses IQ, because neither of those things is true. In an early slide, in an attempt to illustrate the significant impact or correlations of socioeconomic adversity on the human being, I gave you one graph of symptoms of depression, and I'm sure there are critiques of, DSM criteria for depression as well. But the point is, if you have a lot of those symptoms, you're probably having a less good life than if you have none of those symptoms. So I showed a graph of depression, and I showed a graph of IQ. Why did I choose IQ? Because if I said, if I named some other cognitive test, most people probably wouldn't know what it is. And furthermore, IQ, as problematic a measure as it is, has good psychometric properties and at least correlates, maybe for the reasons that psychometricians believe, maybe for other reasons, but it correlates with all kinds of desirable life outcomes, including physical health, right? I mean, who knows why that is? There are undoubtedly complex causal loops. Let me not go down a rabbit hole here, but let me just say, I mentioned IQ as an illustration of past research on poverty that has no neuroscience in it at all. Okay, so so critiques of IQ really don't have any relevance to evaluating the program of the neuroscience of socioeconomic status. Now, about the other, IQ is the 2-letter problematic term. Let's go to the 3-letter problematic term, SES. People do define what they mean by SES in any given study. Sometimes it's family income. Sometimes it's a ratio of family income to needs, to the number of mouths that need to be fed. Even those are inadequate to really capture financial deprivation, because there are different parts of the country, different parts of the world that have different costs of living. There are big differences in family wealth, which is separate from income, that make a difference. But as long as we specify what we mean by SES, which I didn't do study by study because it would have taken too long, but trust me, if you look up these studies, you will see in the methods section that they define what they're looking at. And if it's income, for example, well, that has a lot of relevance to the real world struggles of the poor. And it has a lot of relevance to policy, because as Nikolas was mentioning, there are some very promising studies of unconditional cash transfer. I've actually been working with a group in North Carolina looking at an experiment of a sort of a natural experiment where the Great Smoky Mountain Study of Youth, some families suddenly got cash infusion, and they have fewer of the poverty-related problems than their counterparts who didn't receive this cash infusion. So income matters, and many studies operationalize SES as income. Others operationalize it as educational attainment or parental educational attainment, or ratings of occupational status, which is very related to the social class concept that Nikolas mentioned. Social science, we don't have precise definitions of things like, gravitational mass or something in physics. We do the best we can to identify, significant aspects of a complex system. SES, specifically income, education, occupational status, neighborhood characteristics, subjective social status. These are all, no one of them is perfect. They are all relevant in some sense. They correlate with one another. So that's a very long-winded answer to the question, how can you conclude anything using IQ and SES? A, I don't use IQ. And B, call it class, call it SES, call it deprivation. Science, it's hard. It's hard to do social science. We have imprecise constructs, imprecise terms in our theories, and we muddle along doing our best.
Marta. Tenemos una pregunta del público.
There's a question from the audience, and can we please get a microphone to the person that is going to ask the question? Thank you. The microphone's getting to a member of the audience. My question is going to be in Spanish. I wanted to make a comment actually about what was said before. I think that saying that neuroscience is driving to a deterministic approach to the first years of life is a reductionist approach, because what neuroscience is saying is that it is really important to take into account the environment in the next years of an individual's life, even before conception, but it takes into account that there's huge plasticity afterwards. So there's an influence that can be reverted. So we cannot blame neuroscience for saying that there's deterministic factors. It's the opposite. They're trying to show that there's a big influence, but we need to work on that influence, and there's huge plasticity to our teenage years to revert any effects. So I think we cannot attack neuroscience based on those grounds. I think it's not a good message to be conveyed. And second of all, regarding your other comment about the papers that were done throughout the lifespan of different individuals, there are many papers. Maybe you know papers by Dr. King in Canada. She worked on a natural disaster that happened in the 80s in Canada, and she followed the children of those pregnant mothers at the time until their teenage years. There were changes, even epigenetic changes for those children in their teenage years, and cognitive changes. So there are many papers like that one. And of course, if there are interventions, this can be reverted. So there's no determinism in that point. I wanted to make those two comments.
I'm, of course, aware that Martha and Sebastian have stressed in their work the importance of plasticity. And I would absolutely agree with that. I suppose to just step back a little bit, I would make 2 points. One is what always strikes me, having worked at different times in my life with kids have been brought up in situations of huge adversity, is not so much how little they can do, but how much they can do. The ways in which people who live in very adverse circumstances make lives for themselves, are capable of making all sorts of calculations and decisions in order to make their lives possible. In a different context, I was just reading a very good ethnographic account of the lives of Brazilian street kids. That is, kids who make their money begging on the streets and sometimes stealing, etc., etc. Highly complicated lives, requiring them to do a great deal of calculation to manage themselves, to keep themselves safe, to do one sort of thing and not another sort of thing. These are kids of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, brought up in the favelas in very adverse circumstances, and yet full of skills about the ways in which they might live their lives, probably which would not be picked up in an IQ test. So one of my concerns, I admit to being not a fan of psychometric tests, but one of my concerns is that we focus enormously on what kids and families are not able to do, without realizing the huge struggles, for instance, of lone mothers trying to bring up their kids with alcoholic spouses, and the kids trying to make lives for themselves in conditions of adversity. The enormous number of things that they are and can do across their life course. That's just a reflection on these issues. I think I would like to see much more work, much more rigorous work on what we're calling plasticity. Because I think that also a lot of this work on plasticity is also, the sort of optimistic work, is also subject to exactly the same hype and simplification as you see in the other work. you know, let's have a fecal transplant, let's affect our microbiome, our brains are all subject to inflammation and so on. One sees these arguments made again and again and picked up and simplified and so on. I think the truth is that we know so little about the way in which complex human cognitive and emotional functions develop across the life course, that we should be very, very wary about making those sorts of generalizations. That's not a good answer to your question, for which I apologize.
¿En español? On this, I want to just say two things. One is more specific and the other one is more general or political. And we already talked a little bit. I mean, I think we should agree that plasticity decreases with age. The evidence for neurogenesis, we were talking about this, is right now very much disputed. Liz Gold published work saying that there's adult neurogenesis in mammals like you have in humans or primates like you have in rodents, which reflected birds. But then later, 3 years ago, Arturo Alvarez Huila from UCSF published a paper in Nature showing that possibly this is not true, that the only evidence that he found was until the adolescence and decreasing neurogenesis. And so I think that a lot has been said about neurogenesis, but we don't really know how long it extends. We don't know what it's good for in the human brain. In fact, it only occurs in a very, very small, specific, restricted place in the hippocampus, the dentate gyrus. So I think, I would even put neurogenesis out of the picture because we don't really know what it's good for and for how long it extends. I think we should focus more on synaptogenesis. And synaptogenesis is something that we do have for the entire life. So we do have plasticity for the entire life, but it does decrease over time, right? And actually the main state that gives us new synapses is sleep. And then we can start linking with when people have restrictions, when they have bad sleep at home, that is already affecting the synaptogenesis, right? But I think that there's, we've been making, I think there's this excess of our age, and I think it's been going on for a while, and neurogenesis has been tremendously abused and used to explain everything and without real evidence. In that sense, I think you have a point in some of. I think actually most of us probably agree with you on most criticisms, but then when it gets to real life, and then I come to my second point, I think it's where probably the divide is there. That this whole debate here is so much to the left. I'm coming from Brazil, where the psychopath is in power and no recognition of poverty whatsoever. Actually, 2 days ago, the police of São Paulo entered a very poor neighborhood that was having a big party at 2 a.m. and then killed 9 people, killed nine adolescents who were there just having fun. So given that context, our debate is a little bit abstract, because I am very much convinced that anybody that is studying the neuroscience of poverty, and you actually said it, is coming from a perspective of trying to mitigate poverty, of poverty being a concern, of poverty being something that we need to pay attention to. So I wish that this debate that we're having here was the state of the debate in the world, but we're far from that. We are really, we're going through a class war, right, in which the really, really rich are waging war against everybody else. And in that sense, my sense of urgency is more about how do we refocus the society's worries on what matters rather than, re-engage in these fascist patterns of the past.
¿Comentario? Sí.
I would like to make a comment. The presentations that we saw today are a very good example of a will for scientific collaboration that brings together people with different backgrounds, different trainings, and and people who conceive intervention in different ways, but are still showing the will to collaborate. However, this is so trans-scientific in a way that we need to take into account other dimensions like politics and ethics. And these dimensions are not always hand in hand with the scientific debate. It's not so much about what a neuroscientist is doing in connection with poverty. That's not in the public light in a way. During the break, I was talking with a colleague saying the research on brains and for example, drug addiction being a problem and what neuroscientists have to say, and that makes all of this be seen in a different light. We have to ask scientists how to deal with a society that is very simplistic about trying to understand scientific results. And sometimes scientific results end up hidden in the privacy of a lab or a university. Maybe this is a question I have to pose for Sebastián to answer. There is someone in the panel freezing off, so Kathinka is asking to please do something about the temperature because the room temperature is very low here in our venue. So going back to the question, how do you see the influence of the general public who's very sensitive to what is being said in scientific circles or the academia, because these are topics that are not just for the academia or just about a discipline. They are topics that have to do with public interest, and how do you see the care that we have to take in the interpretation of the results? I come from the field of poverty neuroscience studies, and there's something that Sidarta said. There's a difference between being in Latin America versus other countries in the world, in Europe or in the States or in some other countries where these topics are being or are part of the research. Of course, being a Latin American, I am more connected to the poverty issues the way they are expressed in my territory, in my land. So we have a bigger concern about trying to bring the construction of our building in academia, and we are concerned with taking this knowledge that we are building to a place where we can think about the environment, the life cycle, lifespan, and where we can think about structural barriers that lead people into poverty, losing rights, losing opportunities. And in that context, we believe that there's room for neuroscience to bring more knowledge that could be supplemented with other policies that can be co-built with other disciplines. But this is a very difficult challenge because using neuro in your title, especially because of the excess that we've seen inside neuroscience, there are many colleagues that overdo it and they have their dopamines on asteroids, and there are many difficulties inside our field. Number one, conducting research with experiments that incorporate ecological variables in Latin America is very complex because that means investment from many areas, and it's very difficult, especially in the last 4 years, for example, as Kathinka mentioned. That is one problem on the one hand, to bring the proximate to the distal and see the interaction and how they interact. That is very complex. We need analytical models that drive away from linearity. And these are concerns that we share with colleagues dealing with neuroscience and poverty. This year with Marta Farah, we organized a meeting to discuss the global value of evidence. There's an internal discussion that is being opened up beyond reductionism. There's also an imposing framework in the scientific system, and the investment of the scientific system should be part of this discussion because there are problems with interdisciplinarity. And then we have to take a look at those who use this evidence, because if we cannot bring an emerging ecological knowledge, there's a bias to what we bring to the table. But we do what we can, and we consider that it's important to bring the neurosciences to the table. I agree with the toxic stress topic that our colleague mentioned, which is a metaphor actually, but adversity generates those mechanisms, and there's a lot of money being invested in structural barriers, in education and health policies, but it's in those environments where we want to have a debate. In the sectors that do communication of this, well, there are many issues. The anti-neuro, for example, the non-enthusiasts, and that makes dialogue very difficult. We are not experts in social communication, and whenever we talk to a communicator, they trivialize what we say, or we feel that they are not analyzing and not taking us seriously, and we need to change the type of dialogue we have with politicians who use this evidence in a very circumstantial and opportunistic way. I don't know if that answers your question. Yes, it does. Thank you.
Marcos, primero ahí.
Marcos, you're the first one. No. We really need the mic, otherwise it's going to be impossible to translate. Hello, good morning. I come from a different pathway. I'm an anthropologist, and I worked on poverty in the outskirts of Buenos Aires and in other countries. I think these debates are very interesting, and thank you very much for the presentation. I have a question. I have a brief comment and a question afterwards, which basically originates in a sense of alert. Can we ask ourselves, I'm not going to talk about the knowledge of anthropology, but inequality has been growing for the past decades at a local and a global level, and there's some bias in surveys. Surveys tend to be, want to be neutral and impartial, but then they are applied by policy, and there's a bias there. And you cannot divide surveys and academia to public policies. Why? Because discourse impact is direct. Basically, what do I mean? I worked on drug use in marginalized populations, and the discourse related to this after the 2001-2002 discourse, the discourse of after 2001 and 2 crisis, is that, okay, Paco, this cheap drug kills, crack kills. And I don't know whether there's a policy about that, But I know there's a discourse, like the permanent discourse, the social discourse. So we inform our policies based on those discourses. And there's a very weird association between discourse, policies, and research. And now my question. It doesn't mean that the situation is difficult and we need to simplify. No, it's not that. The poverty context, as Professor Rose was saying, is much more complex than our models. So our surveys, our research, and our models, our neuroscientific models, are too simple to apprehend, to capture, to seize the complexity of poverty. Because basically what we saw were graphs, were lines, were plots. So apart from the debate, how can these models with two variables help to eradicate poverty? How can these graphs and surveys and research improve the social situation of people? Martha, do you want to comment on this? I can make a comment myself. Martha, are you there? Martha, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
No, I mean, if you want to make a commentary on that, from the American perspective, for example.
Yeah, thank you. I mean,
You
you can hear me, yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. Let me just briefly say, I kind of take this comment as an example of the theme that we've been bringing. The theme of, there are huge injustices, structural problems, features of our social and political world that cause harm. We need to change those things. To which, yes, amen. And that it can seem a little bit like, in English we say fiddling a rope burns. I don't know if you have that, playing the violin while the ski is burning down. Be investigating the neuroscience of childhood poverty. And again, maybe I'm just saying that, aspect of this, audience members' comment. But let me say one last thing, and then unfortunately, I believe at 11 o'clock, let me just say,
Martha se está entrecortando.
We cannot hear you properly. We're trying to improve the mainstream. Maybe take the image out. Maybe do an only voice comment. Sí, yo voy a saludar. Por favor, continúe.
Yes.
Yes?
Yes, it is. It's better.
Okay. Well, let me just close by saying, first of all, thank you so much for convening this meeting, for hosting. Thanks to everybody who has been participating. I feel very lucky to have spent my morning with you all. Thank you, Nikolas. I am going to be thinking about everything you said as I walk to work now, and I hope we can talk individually more in the future. Let me just say that I think this sentiment, that this conviction that, you know, the causes of suffering in poverty are rooted in, you know, unjust social circumstances, social, political, physical circumstances, is, you know, is obviously true. And the question is, do we need to try to understand these harms and come up with ways to prevent or ameliorate them just by understanding these external or distal, to use the terminology that Nikolas used, just by focusing on the distal situation? Or is it worthwhile having some people focus on the distal and others focus on the proximal and the internal, i.e. individual psychology and brain? And I think, you know, this is a mighty problem. We need all hands on deck. And I think we need to take all approaches. And I think we need to take them in parallel. So I noticed some of Nikolas's comments referred to beginning with the social determinants, beginning with the public health. And that is a less extreme position than confining our work now and forever to these distal factors. But I think even that is more restrictive than I personally would want to see. I think that working at multiple levels of explanation, multiple loci of explanation, brings added benefits. So let me just stop there and say I'm sure that you don't agree with everything I've said. I hope you agree with a few of the things and at least found it worthwhile listening to. So thank you all again. And now I'm off to walk to work in cold winter Philadelphia. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, Martha. Thank you for being there. Bye. So, yes.
Could I just make
¿Puedo hacer un comentario?
just two things to try and be brief? Firstly, we have seen, even in the developed countries, the consequences of a systematic set of policies that have thrown more and more people into severe adversity. The number of children living in households where the parents are in work but are still in poverty in the UK is in the millions. 4 or 5 million children are brought up in households where the parents are in work but the households are still in poverty. They're in poverty wages, partly because of insecurity of employment, the gig economy, partly because of the nature of welfare benefits and so on. So I think one cannot avoid addressing the neurobiological and mental health consequences of those who are living in those adverse situations. Second, and this is really going to the comment made by the anthropologist colleague. I work a lot with anthropologists, some of whom work in the favelas, work with families in the favelas. And what strikes me, and I just say this again, is the constant struggle in which people live, but the way in which people do make lives for themselves under conditions of extreme adversity. So I'm not a fan of psychometrics. And I am becoming more and more a fan of a kind of more ecologically sensitive approach to understanding these things, by which I mean experiments and research which understands, which focuses on, which charts and understands the ways in which human beings living in particular adverse circumstances make their lives. One of the things that worries me about the neuroscience of poverty is this, that actually at a very early age, children have a clear conception of what people expect of them, of what they can expect of their own life, of how people regard them, and of how they should regard themselves. 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old kids are actively making sense of the world and actively making sense of their position within the world. And if those kids begin to believe that their position in the world is shaped and determined by limitations at the level of their biology, then that itself is going to have consequences for them. I think, although the history of my work, for anybody who knows it, is I'm a theoretical anti-humanist and all those kinds of things, I think we have to understand that human beings do have agency. They are constantly making sense of their world. That stress is not an objective circumstance. It's a way in which an individual makes sense of their life circumstances. And unless we can develop more ecologically appropriate ways of understanding the relations between caregivers, children in their context, then we won't really understand how these very complex ways in which brains are influenced actually work throughout people's lives. We will have experimental situations that for very good reasons are reductionist in a kind of methodological way. That is to say, they reduce the number of variables methodologically, but if we're not careful, they become metaphysically reductionist in that they think that these are the relations that actually work in the world themselves. I'm all in favor of clarity and reductionism to make experimental work clear, but I'm in favor of recognizing that the world itself is not reductionist in that way. And to translate from the experimental situation to the world itself has proved to be very, very difficult. Is it possible to do neuroscience in the wild? I don't know. But I think if we don't do it in the real world in which people live, we just do it in experiments and scanners and things like that, then we kind of miss something which is really important about how people, even in the most adverse situations, make their lives.
Solo por organizarnos. Hay dos.
So we have 2 extra questions. I would like to make a comment, and then we really need to have lunch because they are waiting for us. Please come back. Come back to the questions after lunch. Is that a possibility? Before going to lunch, you really need to leave? Okay, we need to leave, so I would like to make a question. I am Maria Maceo from Observatorio Social. Isn't it high time for neuroscience to ask the private sector and the public sector about inequality, about this growing inequality in the past 100 years, and which is producing the negative effects of poverty? As far as I understand, they have been doing that, especially in the field of social sciences. In neuroscience, and this is my reply.
In an emerging field such as neuroscience and poverty, it's an emerging field that is very new, and we do analysis of individual factors, but that means that it's very difficult to have a dialogue with politics in the context that, as the one you're describing. There are very strong limitations, and part of the responsibility for that is neuroscientists' responsibility and what Cecilia's question mentioned. Now, we need to think about what I said in our introduction. What is the model of human development that we are proposing? Because in one of the slides in Farah's presentation was logarithmic instead of linear. And that's very important information because it depends on what you use. You will find different correlations and variables. So it's not so much about being linear or non-linear, but we need to make progress. And your question is basic, especially for an emerging field. Now, not everybody working in this area have that concept of human development. We are closer to what Nick said. We are working towards human development in an ecological environment. And there are interfaces that need to be taken into account between individuality and collective. We need to also take into account the time factor to take a look at the lives of children or families or social groups. And there are no interdisciplinary links to make it possible to do it at that level. Unfortunately, Martha left the conversation, but we have Nick. And another question is, how much of the disparity that we've seen in the presentations may have to do with the fact that they are on different sides of the Atlantic Ocean? There are different lines of questioning. With Kathinka, we were talking about indifference of academia in the face of people's suffering. Now, as Nick was saying, science doesn't compensate society, and neuroscience cannot do that either. We are on both sides of the ocean, so there's a lot of diversity between the UK and the US, and it's a complex point. We can continue with this discussion later, but maybe we can stop for lunch now. We're going to have the lunch break at this point.